Four ships sailed across the horizon of Japan, just barely out of view over the shores of Shimoda. Steam is blazing out of the beasts and terrifies the Japanese civilians. Many warriors and samurais report to the shores quickly, ready to take on the beasts. What they weren't ready for was the actual reason why the mysterious black ships were there. This is the story of Commodore Matthew Perry and the Japanese expedition. Starting in the past, the US weren't the first ones to visit Japan. Back in 1542 to 1543, the Portuguese had sailed to the Japanese island. Because of how beautiful the island was, they had called it Cipango. While they were there, the Portuguese set up trade between the Japanese and influenced Christianity into Japanese culture. Afterwards, the Spanish visited at around 1549 and the British in the 1600s.
Many other U.S. commodores and sailors attempted to make trade with the Japanese too, right?
Yes, they did, and none of them succeeded. And it wasn't just the U.S. Commodores and sailors and traders, but it was also mostly the Russian traders, sailors as well. And each time they tried to come anywhere near the Japanese shorelines, they were repelled, basically, brutally.
Come 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes emperor. At first, he was tolerant of foreign policies and allowed Christianity to be a main religion in Japan for quite some time. But as time grew on, he became more strict over foreign affairs. He started by completely ridding of Christianity Japan, fully banning it in 1614. He went as far as to persecute followers of Christianity, execute, or even torture them brutally. When Ieyasu finally passed in 1616, his foreign policies would last for decades, coming to be known as the Tokugawa period or the Great Peace. Going back to 1791, Captain John Kendrick of the USS Lady Washington encounters a great storm that blows him off course. Forcing him to take shelter, the closest country was Japan. With knowledge of the current enforcements in Japan, John Kendrick took the chance and decided to request shelter within the country by writing a note in Chinese to the Japanese government because he didn't know Japanese at the time. Unexpectedly, they agreed, and in a few days, John Kendrick was off. This was just the first encounter in Japan, while they were under the Great Peace, also known as the Tokugawa period. Forwarding to 1812, Captain David Porter advised President James Madison that they should open up an expedition route with Japan. Unfortunately, the U.S. was still fighting the War of 1812 at the time, which means they are low on Navy reserves and couldn't spare any naval vessels to negotiate a treaty with Japan. 8 years later, in 1845, the U.S. Congress finally approved a resolution that permitted foreign trade between the U.S. and Japan. They enlisted an official member, Commodore James Biddle, to sail to Japan. When he arrived, many Japanese sailboats surrounded him, wanting to explore the strange ship. He kept requesting officials to talk to, but nobody showed up. After a few days, Biddle became tired and decided to sail to shore to find the Japanese officials by himself. The Japanese sailors pushed him away when he reached shore, telling him that they only traded with the Dutch.
Japan was very adamant about isolating itself from the rest of the world.
Finally, the year 1850 came around. With Millard Fillmore as president of the U.S., expedition missions were at the highest priority with Manifest Destiny in effect at the time. With Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, they agreed they needed to open up an expedition with Japan, since they were running low on coal and other whaling provisions at the time. They needed somebody with independence, patience, but also with a strong will, courage, and respect. They needed a man with diplomatic experience. They needed Commodore Matthew Perry.
He was a very, very skillful diplomat in the sense that he knew how to use both carrots and sticks.
Commodore Perry arrived near the shores of Shimoda, a coastline near the small village of Uragua. He had docked in Edo Bay, aboard the USS Susquehanna. Flanking him were three other ships enlisted by U.S. Navy, the USS Mississippi, Plymouth, and Saratoga. On orders of Millard Fillmore, the president of the U.S. in 1853, Perry was to send a negotiation for treaty and gifts to the Meiji, the High Emperor of Japan at the time. With knowledge of Japan's strict foreign policies and other failed attempts before him, he was determined to set up a trade with Japan. After being warned many times by the Japanese sailors and soldiers alike not to dock into Japan, he docked against their will with the three other ships of his naval fleet backing him up. He had presented the treaty to some officials and delivered letters from President Millard Fillmore to Emperor Meiji, but word had gotten out about the treaty throughout the social classes amongst Japan. Japan's social structure was lined up during the 1600s to 1700s, but by the 1800s, they could notice that the social classes were starting to fall apart. They were lined up in this order. First came the emperor, a puppet head figure that was mainly controlled by the shoguns. Next came the shoguns, the main officials of Japan. They had most of the power that ran through the Japanese government. Next came the daimyos. They still controlled powers, but not as much as the shoguns. Then came the samurais. Many elite warriors earned this title and had the honor of Japan, and were seen as more important than the classes below it. Then there were the farmers, the majority of Japan. Over 80% of the population in Japan were farmers. Then lastly, under the farmers were the artisans and merchants, seen as lazy by the Japanese government. The social classes saw the treaty as a new opportunity for Japan. They had split up into three sides on the treaty. One side said that they wanted to adopt the treaty entirely. Most of those people were the merchant classes because they saw it as a trading opportunity. The second group said that they wanted to adopt the treaty but still keep their tradition. These were mostly the farmers and samurais. The last side said no completely, and these were mostly the important government officials such as the shoguns, since they were strict on tradition and wanted to keep Japan on their own terms. Perry was wintering in Hong Kong when Japan was still making the decision about the treaty, but a new situation arose. Matthew Perry noticed that Russia and France were making their way to Japan to negotiate a treaty with them as well. When he returned to Japan for the second time on February 13, 1854, he had a new addition to his navy, the USS Powhatan, a new ship that the U.S. had sent over to counteract against the other countries. After some negotiating, Commodore Matthew Perry had finally gotten clearance to dock in Japan to meet up with some Japanese officials. He docked his naval fleet on March 8, 1854 at Tokyo Bay, near Yokohama, Japan. After being given time to discuss the treaty, Japanese officials finally agreed to meet with Commodore Matthew Perry to negotiate. They set up a meeting at Kyoto to finalize the treaty. This was known as the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa or the Perry Convention. Matthew Perry and his son, Oliver Perry, Commander Adams, interpreter Samuel Williams, Japanese interpreter Yenosuke, and a few unnamed Japanese officials were some of the attendees of the meeting. The Treaty of Kanagawa had a stance that favored the U.S. specifically, as it included that Japan will open up ports Shimoda and Hakodate as trading ports for the U.S., that shipwrecked U.S. sailors may seek refuge in Japan without repercussion unless they act against Japanese law, and that the U.S. would receive the most favored nation clause, meaning any privileges given to the other countries would also be given to the U.S. These were just some of the few terms on the treaty. After negotiating the treaty, Commodore Matthew Perry traveled to the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to explore them, then delivered gifts to Emperor Meiji. Some of the gifts were weapons like muskets, cannons, and swords, since Japan was behind in technology due to the period of Great Peace. Perry left Japan in around 1854. When Perry finally returned to the U.S. in 1855, he spent the last of his years writing books about his encounter with Japan to document his experience. Matthew Perry passed away on March 4, 1858 in New York. Commodore Matthew Perry's encounter with Japan is extremely significant to history. Japan was essential to the colonization of Asia and many other important events in world history, such as World War II. If Perry had not broken them out of the Tokugawa period, our whole course of history could be changed. But our world is how it is now because of Commodore Matthew Perry and the Japanese expedition.